67 books, 32,819 pages, over 5 genres, and I'm gonna tell you what was worth my time. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I am well aware that it is the end of January. However, I have yet to give you all of my book stats, all of the things that happened in 2024 in order for us to move on to 2025 and see what we're reading together. I feel like I really exceeded my own expectations for 2024 with my reading. I set a goal of 75 books and I was just shy of that with 67. Now, 2024 was the year that I got married, went on my honeymoon, planned a wedding, did all of that stuff. So with all of that considered, I didn't know that when I set my goal. We got married pretty fast, and so I didn't necessarily assume that I would be hitting my goal once we kind of got in the works of planning a wedding. But for me to get that close, I was pretty proud of myself. I read 67 books, 32,819 pages. My average book length was 497 pages. Now, keeping that in mind, okay, I would say I kind of did reach my goal because I feel like your goal should honestly be page numbers instead of amount of books because the length is always so different, especially if you're a mostly fantasy reader like I am. I rest my case, but I'm just saying it kind of makes more sense to do it that way. My average star rating is 3.7 stars, which isn't as high as I would like it to be. However, it's not terrible. I think the longer I go on my reading journey, the more harshly I rate the books that I read because I know what I really enjoy. I'll stand by it forever. You've probably heard all of your favorite book talkers, booktubers talk about how 5 stars is a feeling. Sometimes it doesn't make any sense, but that's a 5-star book. It's very rare for me to give out 5 stars, and when I do, I really, really mean it with my full chest. Not because it is like this perfection book, which sometimes it is, but usually it's just a feeling. I did read 5 different genres this year. I read romance, fantasy, sci-fi, young adult, and historical fiction, which was a brand new one for me. It would take me actually 8 years to pitch each and every one of these books to you and kind of give you the premise and the synopsis of each, so I'm not gonna do that. I'm just gonna go by months, tell you what I read, give you a few words about them and if it was worth my time, and let you know my star rating. From that, hopefully it'll give you some ideas for this coming year, what you want to read, what you want to branch into. January's first read was Assistant to the Villain by Nicole Maher? This is about a girl with essentially a rebellious streak who goes to work for the infamous villain of their country. Very funny, a lot of laugh out loud scenes, great palate cleanser. I rated this 4 stars. It was honestly a fantastic read. Next was a Crescent City 1 and 2 reread in anticipation for the 3rd book that came out at the end of this past January. I really loved these more and more on the reread. I think the first time I just wasn't anticipating how high fantasy it is. Now I will say they're approachable for high fantasy, but they are a little bit harder to swallow, especially if you're used to the romantasy subcategory and all of those types of genres. I will say the story is not spoon-fed to you and you are gonna have to do a little bit more work, a little bit more research to understand these. However, I do highly recommend, and I had a really good time reading these. I gave these each 4.5 stars. Next is one of my favorite duologies of the year is the Shepherd King duology. One Dark Window is the first one, and then it's Two Twisted Crowns. This is by Rachel Gillig. This is a gothic fantasy which centers around a girl who has a monster in her head. She's set on a course to cure her town from a magical curse that's been set. And of course, with the company of a gorgeous man who just so happens to be the king's nephew. Funny how that happens. I gave the first one 4.5 stars. I gave the second 4 stars. Moving on to February, I had such a fantastic reading month in January that I was so excited to dive into my first read of February, which was Butcher and Blackbird, okay? I had high hopes. This had high ratings. 1 star, absolutely atrocious. Need I comment more? Then this next book saved me from having the ick the rest of the year, 7 Year Slip by Ashley Poston. Absolutely one of my favorite romances I've ever read. Gave this 5 stars off the bat. It battles a lot of serious issues like grief and mental health and dealing with a lot of stuff that we put to the side and decide not to think about. Of course, it's a romance novel. We have 2 people falling in love, but the catch is there's magic realism in this book. So these people are separated 7 years in time and they must find their way back to each other. This book healed my heart in so many ways. I absolutely loved it so much. Gothicana by Rue Nix was my next read. Now, this book was definitely written by AI. The cover was designed by AI, so I gave this 2 stars. Did I hate it? Honestly, not really, but it really just wasn't necessarily worth my time. Dark Academia, Forbidden Fruit, Professor Student, this was not for me. It might be for you, but it was not for me. Next up was Bride by Allie Hazelwood. This is a marriage of convenience between a werewolf and a vampire. So essentially if Bella ended up with Jacob, except Jacob is bald and they have the chemistry of a toothpick and a molar, take with that what you will. It was okay. I gave it 3 stars. I understand why people like it. I just was kind of confused at all the fanfare, to be honest. However, I do really like Allie Hazelwood and it's nothing against her. I actually really like her other books. Next up is Divine Rivals and Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. This is one of the very few YA novels that I really recommend and really enjoyed. I'm not the biggest YA reader, and still in this, there were some issues that I had where I just was like, if this wasn't YA, this would be phenomenal, just because I felt that some of the story was spoon-fed to me. Overall, it's a young adult romantic fantasy where essentially these two writers end up on the front lines of a war that they really have no business being around. They discover that there's a lot more lore going on with their country and their world, and gods that are involved. A whole plethora of things that they didn't assume would be a part of this war. I did absolutely love this. I rated the first one 4.5 stars, and I rated the second one 3.75. Last year was the year that I read Harry Potter all the way through for the very first time. As a child, I wasn't allowed anywhere near that series. I'm sure some of you can relate. And I actually really enjoyed it. I read The Half-Blood Prince and Deathly Hallows. I gave it 4.5 and 4. Not gonna go on about this. Pretty much everybody and their mother has read this or watched this series, and I just honestly thought that it was really well done, especially for a YA series. Again, it's not my favorite thing, but I did really enjoy it. The only thing that I felt was lacking from this series was a little bit more of a redemption arc for Draco, and I'm sure a lot of us feel that way, but also I'm a romantasy reader, so we love to see the villain kind of make a comeback. I personally need to see a fanfiction if Snape and Lily ended up together. Does that exist? If you've been on my page at all, you know that I love this book, so let's not start with the hate in the comments, okay? Let's just not start. This is the third book in the Crescent City series by SJM, and by no means do I think that everything that SJM writes is perfect. I mean, I do think that, but that's not why I rated this 5 stars. I did because I am personally emotionally attached to these characters. The time of my life when I read this was just a really special time of my life, and I think that a lot of the chapters and pages in this book are now correlated with memories from my personal life. So now I'm just very attached to this book. As you can see, I tabbed it a lot. I really had a good time reading this, and I understand a lot of people's questions. I know why they felt the way that they do. But again, this is an incomplete story, so there's really no room for judgment yet until we get all of our questions answered. I understand the qualms. I know why people feel the way that they do, but I personally just had a fantastic reading experience with this book, and I'm very emotionally attached. Moving on to March, the first book that I read was Black Prism by Brent Weeks. Now, I made a trade with my husband, and I said I would read this, which is his favorite series, if he'd read Throne of Glass. Now, I read this in the first 2 weeks of March. He read Throne of Glass and finished it 2 weeks ago, in January 2025. And might I just add that Black Prism was like 300 pages longer than Throne of Glass, so not necessarily a fair trade, but it's okay. I liked this book. It's definitely really heavy on the sci-fi, really heavy on the high fantasy. I wasn't necessarily in my high fantasy era when I read this. I really like the premise. He told me to keep going and that it gets better, and to be fair, I told him the same thing about Throne of Glass, so we'll see if I continue. Next up is the last 4 books in the Magnolia Parks universe. We've got Daisy Hates Magnolia Parks The Long Way Home, Daisy Hates The Great Undoing, and Magnolia Parks Into the Dark. If you follow me at all, you know that I'm an absolute stan for these books. These are some of the most beautiful literary fiction examples of big characters but having real deep human emotions, and really helped me understand people in a deeper way, and I think about these every single day. There's really no explanation as to why these books affected me so much. These characters are high society, gang lords, so out of touch with reality, and yet they changed permanently a piece of my soul. They all got between 4 and 5 stars, but I will say Into the Dark was my absolute favorite of the entire year. I think about this book every single day. It inspired part of my wedding vows. I just loved everything about this, and I think the conclusion to Magnolia's story was beautiful. I cannot wait for the completion of Daisy Hates' story. I fear it could break me. I do. Six of Crows, Grand Heist, Guy with a Limp, girl whose entire identity is being super quiet. Once again, I say I'm not a huge YA girl. I totally understand why people liked this, but I fear my personal experience was not grand. I do need to try again, and I also need to read the second one. It could have just been the place and time that my brain was in. I was full-fledged wedding planning when I tried to read this. It just didn't enthrall me enough to really bring me into the world. I felt very disconnected to the characters. I think if you like YA, fantasy, heist, found family, all that stuff, I do think that you'll enjoy this. It just for some reason didn't hit for me, but it might for you. Moving forward to April, I started my month by reading Binding 13, the first book in the Boys of Tommen series. If you've read this, you know why this is kind of a big deal. This was the longest book I read this year, 1,066 pages, and it is a YA high school romance. Now, I will follow that by saying I think every single page was worth it, and I think it could have been longer. This book should not be YA. The topics that are discussed are so triggering and so intense and damaging to your heart that you really do need to check the trigger warnings before you pick this book up. I loved it. I felt like it was demonstrated very well. I felt like the characters took on a romance that was so beautiful considering what the characters were going through at the time. I highly recommend, but also, again, be very careful picking this up if you have a history of domestic violence, abuse, anything like that. I would just be very careful. In no world did I think that a book that long, that's simply a high school romance, would affect me the way that it did, so. Next up, Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. Every single romance author should bow down to Miss Abby, okay? I don't know how she does it. There's magic in these pages, okay? The way that she writes a non-cringe romance that is just perfect. It's just perfect. Every page is perfect. It's laugh out loud. It's comedic relief. It's heavy in parts that it needs to be, and the romance is just so believable and realistic. 5 stars. This is my favorite book of hers. It absolutely ate. Loved it so much. And then I followed that by Heartless by Elsie Silver. I'm just not an Elsie Silver girl. I hate to say it, I'm just not. I felt like it was insta-love, hiding behind the single dad trope, falling in love with a nanny. It was just way too hot and heavy, way too early. And I also read it right after Abby Jimenez. And so I fear I was comparing. Just was not for me. I gave up on Elsie Silver after that. Now, I'm not saying that I will forever, but it's just not necessarily for me. Moving on to May, the first thing I did was my ACOTAR reread. I read this one in May, and then in July, I read Akamath. I'll say it till I die, it's popular because it's good. And if you haven't read it because you're afraid of the hype, just read it anyway. It's so good. Just like every other basic girl on the planet, this is my favorite book series ever besides Throne of Glass. And it is that good, okay? It just is. This book specifically I gave 4 stars, but Akamath and On I gave like 1,000,000. Then I read the next 3 books in the Boys of Tommen series, which was Keeping 13, Saving 6, and Redeeming 6. Keeping 13 was super good. I stand with 4.5 stars, and I stand with everything I said about Binding 13. Be very careful with your trigger warnings. I will say for the next 2 books, I didn't necessarily connect as well to Joey's story. And I just didn't like it overall as much as the first 2 books. I gave Joey's books in that, so Saving 6 and Redeeming 6, 3 stars each. Next up is Funny Story by Emily Henry. 2 people who are in perfect seeming relationship end up as exes. Then those exes end up as roommates while the other exes end up getting married. Are you following? And then, as you'd assume, the roommates kind of endeavor into their own relationship. It's cute. It's funny. It didn't hit like Beach Read, okay? I've heard many mixed reviews on this. I gave this 3 stars. It just wasn't all the way up there for me, but I do love Emily Henry. In June, I read Bridgerton 1, 2, 3, and 4. I don't remember the names of them, and that kind of explains how I felt about the books. The lines that we love in the show are not delivered the same in the book, and I was just bored. I was just bored. I'm sorry to say it. I'm sorry if you love those books. They were fun. They were cute, but they weren't all there. I gave 3 stars each. And then I decided not to continue with the series because I just was like, meh, this is kind of boring. Then I read Taming 7, which is the 5th book in the Boys of Tommen series, and that book needs to be about 1,000 pages shorter. It was completely incomparable to the other 4 in the series. So I personally wouldn't waste your time reading that one. I gave that 2 stars. Obviously June wasn't a phenomenal reading month for me, but it was also my wedding month, so I really wasn't delving deep into my reading journey during that time. Moving on to July, I read A Novel Love Story by Ashley Poston, the same author as 7 Year Slip, and I felt like I was stuck in a Hallmark cringy rom-com movie the entire time. Now, if you look at the premise of the book, that is what the book is about. But I felt a little too trapped. I was stuck there for a little too long. It was way too out of touch. It was not realistic enough for me. I think I DNF'd on the last chapter, I'm not gonna lie. August, I was back on my grind after getting back from the wedding, and I ended up reading a lot more, which I was very happy about. Started off with Serpent and the Wings of Night, and then Ashes and the Star-Cursed King, and then Six Scorched Roses. It's a duology, and then there's a novella that comes right after. Really enjoyed this story. I had picked this up and DNF'd it the first time. I read like 19 chapters, and then I just had to stop. And then when I picked it up the second time, I really, really liked it. This story throughout the duology goes enemies to lovers, to enemies to lovers, to enemies to lovers, to enemies to lovers. She did it really creatively, but I will say it was slightly repetitive and could have been a little shorter in the second book. But I did really enjoy this, and I felt like it was done in a very creative way that I hadn't seen done before. I gave the first one 4 stars, the second one 3, and the novella 3. Next up, I did my reread of books 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the Throne of Glass series, my all-time favorite series. As you can see by all the tabbing that I did, this was a full experience. The first time I read this was amazing, but going back and reading the beginning of the story, having the knowledge that I know now, just made this story so much more special and unique. And I highly recommend rereading this series if you've read it and loved it, because it is a totally different experience reading the beginning of the story again. I'm not gonna go on and on about how much I love this series, but I really, really do, and once again, it's popular because it's really that good. Next up is the Prison Healer trilogy. I did really like this. Again, it's YA, felt very repetitive, and I just do have a hard time with that. I did listen to this on audiobook, and I think that the narrator really makes or breaks the story. Her voice, for some reason, was so hard for me to listen to, and so I think that it brought the story down a notch for me. I rated them all 3 stars. I thought that they were really cute. I wouldn't necessarily say it was a waste of time. I do think overall it was a good trilogy. It just was slightly repetitive to me. Next up, I read Never by Jessa Hastings. It was cool, interesting. It wasn't the magic I'm used to in Jessa Hastings' writing. Now, I will say, the very first time I read Magnolia Parks, the very first book in the series, I hated it. I despised it. I didn't understand what was going on. I continued with the series, and it became one of my all-time favorite series. It's literally in top 3 for me. So I'm never going to just judge Jessa Hastings' first book in a series, and the rest are not out yet. So I assume she could do a lot with this series that I'm not anticipating yet. So I'm not going to give a full rating on this because I feel like it's unfair knowing what she's done to me in the past. Then I read X-Files and You with a View by Jessica Joyce. These were such sweet, cute palate cleanser romances that were not cringy. They were very accessible. They were very easy to relate to your own life. I will say the X-Files specifically is very comparable to Happy Place by Emily Henry. And then You with a View, I felt like I was reading my own character off of the page, the perfectionism of that character. I was like, oh, so this is about me. Is this play about us? Her characters were written in such a way that just made me feel like I was a part of the story, and I highly, highly recommend this author. She's now an auto-buy author for me. Next up, I did my very first read of Hunger Games 1 through 3. I really enjoyed it. Again, I totally see the hype around it. I gave it 3.5 to 4 stars. Next up, I read Powerless and Powerful by Lauren Roberts. Obviously, there is a lot of talk about this book going on around book talk, around the internet, all over. I will say this. If you've never read fantasy, you've never read YA, you've never read Hunger Games, you've never read Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard, you'll enjoy this, okay? I had freshly read Red Queen the year prior, and I had freshly read Hunger Games, okay? There is a difference between pulling inspiration from and just writing a exact copycat, and I fear the editors really missed the mark with understanding what was already in literature, what was already in media, because this was exactly the same. I will say Powerful, the little novella that comes after this, was its own story. I did really enjoy that one. I gave this 2 stars. Honestly, I could go lower. The story itself is okay, but only if you've never read anything else. Moving on to September, I read Summer Romance by Annabelle Morgan. Similar to Jessica Joyce, this was just a really, really cute story about a mom who's never chosen herself and always chose everybody around her, and she basically just has to start over. I rated this 4 stars, I had a good time reading it, and just a fantastic palate cleanser. I read Vicious by V.E. Schwab. I have a love-hate relationship with this author. I think that she does phenomenal work, but I'm not entirely sure that her work is for me. I've previously read The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, and while I can understand the hype around that story, I just was kind of bored. Now, I do think that was very early on in my reading journey, and I think I need to try again. I did like this one a little bit better. This is dark academia meets 2 serial killers, so I'm kind of convinced they're in love. Now, this is not a romance, don't get me wrong, but the angst seemed misdirected, okay? It was giving tension, it was giving you're kind of in love, so now you're obsessed with killing each other, and I think they just need maybe some therapy, like some couples therapy. I really liked it, but I don't personally enjoy super dark stories. It made me feel a little creeped out, I'm not gonna lie, and I don't love feeling that way. I gave it 3.5 stars. It was very well written, but I'm just not sure that the story was for me. Next up is one of my all-time favorite reads of the year, favorite reads ever, is this small little book, Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. I don't know what this small book did to change the chemistry of my brain, but it sure did, and I still think about some of the quotes in here on a daily, weekly basis. Think Bridgerton meets like ACOTAR. There's a drop of fantasy in here, but it's really more of like a historical romance. Essentially, it begs the question, what do you do with half of your soul? Can you fall in love? Can you still be yourself with half a soul? It is very interesting and really allows you to kind of look into your own mind introspectively and think, what would I do if I were her? What is actually happening in this? I loved this. It made me question my life. And books like this are just so underrated, and I never in a million years expected to rate a 200-something page book over 5 stars, but here we are. I highly recommend. Take this as one of my highest recommendations of this video. This will take you no time. If you're trying to hit your reading goal for the month or whatever you're trying to do, read this. Read this. Moving on to October. One for My Enemy by Olivia Blake. This is Romeo and Juliet, but think New York, think witches, think modern day. The prose and the poetry that is this woman's writing is phenomenal. So much so that this blonde girl had a hard time following at times, and there are still plot things that I'm not entirely sure I fully grasped, to be totally honest with you. Her writing is pretentious, but in a way that makes you feel it is important, and I got that quote from Madison Kate, my favorite book girl. But it's true, and her writing really made me desire to understand the story on a deeper level so I could see like what she was seeing in these characters. Her banter was on point. The romance in this was just gorgeous. I really, really liked this, although I'm still a little confused. I gave it 3.75 stars. Next, I did my Fourth Wing reread, and to be honest, I want to be the cool kid that's like, yeah, honestly, it's not that good. I don't know why people really like it that much. I love it. I'm sorry to say, I do love it. And is it literary perfection? No. But is it perfection to me? Yeah, I gave this 5 stars. I don't care. I don't care. It's so addicting. The character development in these stories is just Rebecca Yarros. I would like to sift through your brain and understand how you made Zayden Ryerson the most addicting character I've ever read about. I'm gonna do a whole video on the series and if it's worth your time and if only girls are gonna like this series and just a lot of kind of literary questions I have about the series. But I have a lot to say about this, and I think that people hate for no reason and people hate because it's popular. And again, things become popular usually because they're good, so just give it a chance, okay? I'm not saying it's perfection, but to me it was, okay? Moving on to November, this romantasy girl took a trip into Brandon Sanderson high fantasy world, okay? This was recommended to me, I can't even tell you how many times. I'm not done with the series yet. I'm probably going to finish the third one, The Hero of Ages, this month. January, February 2025. I'm terrified because this series has really gathered my ability to dive deep into a story that you really don't understand from the beginning. Characters are so vital, they're so important, and the way that Brandon Sanderson writes just makes you feel like every piece of information is absolutely vital, and he does a really good job of bringing things back up to help you understand them so that you don't just feel kind of dumb the whole time. This is my first real high fantasy, and it's challenged me a lot, and I'm almost done, and I really feel like the payoff is going to be worth it. This is giving, you have to work really hard for it, but it's going to be totally worth it. I'm going to make a video in the future about if I think high fantasy is accessible and attainable to romantasy readers, because this is my first time ever diving into something this intense. And I really feel like for us romantasy girls, like we have a place in this world. I have a lot to say about this and I'll do it in that video, but I've really, really enjoyed this. I gave this book like 3.5 stars. I fear it'll be higher once I finish the series because there's a lot of stuff in here that you don't necessarily understand, but a quote that I heard from somebody who really convinced me to read this was, "Nothing mattered until everything did." So I assume at the end of The Hero of Ages, the third book, a lot of this stuff will make a lot of sense to me, and again, I think it'll be totally worth the work and the effort I put into it. Then I got a little ambitious and I picked up more Brandon Sanderson books, some of his standalones. I picked up Trust of the Emerald Seed and I picked up Warbreaker. I wish I had listened to people that told me to wait to do that until a certain time in the Brandon Sanderson universe. I think I took on too much at once and I had a hard time really understanding what was going on. I will say I read these over audiobook and I don't recommend that, especially for newer high fantasy readers. I was very lost, very confused, and I think I need to reread these in the order that everybody told me to read them in. I'm not going to give a rating because I feel like that wouldn't be fair because I think that these books are well deserving of my time and effort, and I'm not sure that I put in the work for these ones yet. And December, the last month of the year, my Iron Flame reread in anticipation for Onyx Storm, which came out this month, January 2025. This book was a letdown for a lot of people. I will say it could be 200 to 300 pages shorter. I do think the information here is necessary and I love the story. It is addicting. And so I really don't have that many complaints about this. I think that a lot of people's arguments about it being a little too long are absolutely valid. I think Rebecca Yarros learned from that and she's making her books a little bit shorter and a little bit more concise and to the point, and I really appreciate that. And so I gave this book 3 stars, but overall, I mean, the characters are still very important to me, so I do recommend this book and continuing the series. Last but not least, I ended the year absolutely hating my life by reading these sob fest books that you guys recommended to me. The Nightingale, The Great Alone, and The Women by Kristen Hanna. This was my first experience in the historical fiction world to this depth. I don't know what trauma Kristen Hanna has been through to make me sit and watch the demise of these women being absolutely helpless to help them as they recover their lives from absolute ground zero in all 3 of these books. But I'll never be the same. I cannot recommend this author enough. I feel like it has absolutely changed the way that I look at my life, the thankfulness I have for the life that I lead. Specifically, The Women really, really affected me, but all 3 of these books are just absolutely phenomenal. All 3 of these books are absolutely phenomenal. I cannot recommend them enough. Whoever recommended these to me, I hate you and I love you. I feel like I'll never escape these stories. They live in my brain rent-free. And these are just beautiful literature. The fact that these exist, the fact that I can pick these up and read these just in my normal day-to-day life, just relaxing on the couch. Like, if you've read these, you understand. It's like, they're so sad. But these are real stories, like they're fiction, but these kinds of things happen to these people and it's based on true events. I'm assuming that happened in real time. And yeah, I'll just never be the same. I can't really, I don't even know what to say. I gave The Women 5 stars, I gave The Great Alone 4 stars, and I gave Nightingale 4.5. These are amazing, okay? But you will be destroyed, okay? Overall, it was such a good reading year. I feel like I expanded my taste so much. Compared to 2023, I read less than half of the books that I read in 2024. I feel like my taste in books has expanded so much. I feel like I understand more of what I like and what I don't like. And I feel like I've branched out a lot to really understand more of my reading taste. I hope that if you haven't done that, you get to do that this year. And I hope that this list kind of helped you compile some good books that you might want to add to your list for 2025. If you have any suggestions, let me know. I love reading the books that you guys tell me to read. Obviously, a lot of them destroyed me this year. Also, if you have any specific book videos you want me to make or just different reading vlogs or things like that, please let me know. I do this for you guys. I love reading with you and I love hearing your feedback. If you're new here, obviously like and subscribe, do all the commenting, do the things. I love chatting with you guys. I'm also on Instagram at Books with Soph Soul and on TikTok at Books with Soph Soul. In the description, I'll link my Fable and my Goodreads as well. But again, I love reading with you, and let me know what you'd like to see more of. Bye!